engineer with the firm Moffitt and Nickel in the U.S. I'm also the PIANC USA representative to the Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. But today I'm just the moderator, trying to host this webinar on investing in climate change adaptation and resilience for the port and maritime industry. So one really important thing I should note ahead of time is that this meeting will be recorded. The team's screen, audio, video, everything is being recorded by PIANC. Just to make you aware of that, it will be posted through PIANC's website. You can look out for PIANC's LinkedIn channel. We should have an announcement when it's posted, and I think there'll be something on the website as well. So to avoid any more delay, I'll just say the way this is going to work is that we'll have two presentations from people that I'll introduce in a moment, and then we'll have a panel discussion in the last half an hour. The speakers you'll hear from in order first are Ms. Jan Brooke, and Jan is the chair of PIANC's Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. I'm the secretary of that group, so I work with Jan quite a lot. Jan also works as an advisor to the UK and European ports on climate change adaptation issues, and she will speak on a business case for adapting to climate change in our industry. And then following that will be a presentation by Mr. Neil Dulles, and Neil is with TT Club, a maritime industry or transportation industry insurer and risk management provider. Neil has 20 plus years engineering experience with local authorities and consultancies, and then 11 years in the port industry in various roles. And Neil is part of the loss prevention team for TT Club, and he will speak about climate change adaptation from his perspective. And so without any additional delay, I'll just remind everyone it's being recorded. Please, if you have any questions, because your mics are muted, please put your questions in the chat. I'll follow those. And I'll just ask Jan to go ahead and start her presentation.
Thanks very much, Brian. So just to check, do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Is it in presentation mode yet?
No, it's in slide mode. So we can see your individual slides on the left. So it's not quite in presentation mode yet.
Last time this worked. Why isn't it working? Oh, now do you see it in presentation mode? Perfect. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction, Brian. As Brian said, I chair PIANC's task group on climate change. So I'm very pleased we've got so many people today. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar. My introductory presentation today is looking at a publication that was published last year now on scoping the business case for investment in climate change adaptation. Hang on, so I need to be able to move the slides forward. Okay, yeah. So PIANC has been doing over the last few years quite a lot of work on climate change adaptation and preparedness. The reason or the motivation, if you like, for this work has been the business risk that climate change poses to the port and inland waterway sector, with the increase in frequency of extreme events, and also the impacts of slow onset changes in air and water temperature, in the precipitation characteristics, sea level, and so on. And so we're already seeing impacts in terms of flooding, in terms of storminess, and conditions that exceed critical operational thresholds. On inland waterways affecting inland ports, we have problems with extreme high flow or low flow, reducing navigability. So it's not only limited, climate change impacts are not only limited to seaports. And one of the important points when we think about how we justify investment in adaptation and in strengthening resilience of our waterborne transport networks is the link that ports have in the wider transport system. Because climate change not only compromises infrastructure integrity and affects navigational safety, but it leads to downtime, which disrupts business continuity and it increased costs. And we also see, and we're already seeing as a result of not only climate change, but other events, that cascading effects multiply quickly, impacting onward transport. We have impacts on energy or water supply, on telecommunications, and these things together impact on supply chains. So the owners and operators of port and navigation infrastructure and investors in that infrastructure need to act to strengthen resilience. And when we're talking about climate change, we're talking not only about sorry, I'm trying to move my slide forward. Let's find some way of doing that. We're talking not only about the water's edge port itself, but also the navigation zone, so the approaches and the infrastructure on the port estate, loading, unloading, equipment, offices, manufacturing processes in some cases, and then the hinterland connections, so connections to road and rail, to inland shipping and so on. And those activities across that entire zone can be impacted by changes in temperature, by changes in precipitation, by changes in storminess, by changes in water chemistry and biology, by changes in fog and so on, a wide range of potential impacts that we need to anticipate and prepare for. The type of consequences that we're already seeing in the sector are described in the annex to the report that helps on scoping the business case, where we carried out a survey during 2018-2019, asking ports and navigation operators what their experience was of extreme events that could be associated with or are consistent with the climate change projections. And what we found from the responses there was that ports and waterways are already experiencing problems with extreme wind and waves, extreme rainfall, that's high or low rainfall, flood events, low flow impacts on inland waterways. And we asked about damage and cleanup costs, and that resulted in responses ranging from less than $100,000 to damage and cleanup exceeding $10 million. And when we then carried out an additional literature search, we identified events where damage costs exceeded 10 million. Some of those are wider than only the port, so they weren't included as port specific. But you see already that we're experiencing events with very significant costs. When we asked about how significant those costs were, and here we're talking about post-event cleanup, damage, repair, and associated activities, around a third of ports, those ports and waterway operators that responded, described the post-event consequences as being significant or critical to their port. And I think also it's important to note that even when we're dealing with damages of less than $1,000, for ports in developing countries, for smaller ports, and those ports with resource constraints, even that level of damage can represent a significant challenge. We also found from the responses that it is quite common to recognise the damage, the cost of damage that is covered by insurance, but relatively fewer ports and waterway operators are actually trying to quantify the cleanup costs, the additional maintenance costs, and so on. So the focus has tended to be on valuing the insured losses, and this is something we'll talk about more as we go through the session today. We also ask in this survey about the impacts of delays and disruption. And our respondents found it much more difficult to put a money value on delay and disruption when compared to damage repair. But around a quarter of respondents highlighted costs of more than $100,000, and some reported costs of $1 million plus up to more than $10 million. Again, here we asked the ports responding about the significance of the consequences of that extreme event. And what we found was that even those respondents who couldn't put a money value on could qualitatively explain whether or not the the consequences were significant or critical. And what we saw was that while about a third of those responding to the survey in terms of damage and cleanup felt that the consequences were significant or critical, almost half of those respondents reported that the impacts on delays, disruption, and downtime were significant. So relatively speaking, we had more difficulty in quantifying the respondents had more difficulty in quantifying the effects of downtime or disruption, but more felt that those impacts were what was really significant. And when we're talking about impacts, this is an example from Argentina. A big storm went through in December 2023. This is the type of damage we see associated with strong winds and unprecedented wind speeds. And then another example, actually, which as far as I'm aware is still ongoing in the UK, Storm Dara, which came through in December last year, led to the collapse of a fender on a berth at Holyhead Port in Wales, which brought down the concrete pile and the platform and connecting walkways. Holyhead Port is one of the biggest gateways between the UK and Ireland. It was reported before Christmas that port would remain closed until at least mid-January. And you see here some of the headlines in terms of both the impacts on both individuals, on families, and on trade of the closure of this port. Now, this is not, in UK terms, considered one of our major ports, but nonetheless very important for the trade travel generally between Wales and Ireland. And when you look a little bit deeper into the consequences that are already being documented here, severe effects on logistics, on ferry operations, more than approximately 100,000 people who are planning to use the ferry route to travel between Ireland and the UK for Christmas. The fact this is a critical time of year, then also mentioning of the additional cost of rerouting goods and the lack of support for the supply chain. So when you look at the headlines, both in the popular press and the technical press for this kind of event, you start to get a sense that the impact of failing to act to adapt to climate change is potentially much wider than only the impact on the port itself. At a more mundane level, if you like, we see not only the events of the consequences of big events like storms, but we also see these slow onset changes not only in air temperature, but also water temperature. And for inland navigation, warmer temperatures can bring challenges. It can increase growth rates of native vegetation, resulting in navigational safety risks, meaning more cutting. Vegetation management is required. Warmer waters can facilitate the establishment of invasive alien species, which have consequences not only for ecology, but also for infrastructure integrity. And we see similar problems associated with water temperature in coastal and marine areas. So whereas a lot of what we're focusing on today is extreme events of extreme rainfall, extreme wind and waves and so on, there are other wider events, consequences that climate change will bring, to which we need to adapt and strengthen resilience. In 2020, PIANC produced its first climate change adaptation guidance. This is Working Group Report number 178, and that report sets out a 4-stage process to help ports and waterways understand what they can do to try to adapt to the changing climate, what the options are, and how they can identify and evaluate those options. So first of all, looking at the scene setting, understanding what are the critical assets, operations and systems, who else, which other stakeholders need to be engaged, what the objectives are for adaptation, what the acceptable level of risk is, and so on. And then collating the relevant climate data, carrying out a risk or vulnerability assessment, identifying options, evaluating those options, implementing those options, and then reviewing them to be able to inform subsequent decision making. what we knew, even when we were preparing this guidance note, this working group report, was that there are two main barriers that we saw in practice that were constraining port and waterway operators' ability to adapt, to deliver adaptation changes. And one of those was dealing with uncertainty. Climate change brings massive uncertainties in terms of how much change by when will certain impacts, when will impacts be expected, how significant those would be. And of course, ultimately, those uncertainties remain because so many decisions are tied to the political ability to deliver a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. And so the amount of response of governments to reduce emissions will determine how quickly some of these changes will take place. So Technical Note No. 1 that was published in 2022 is also, as with all these reports, available to download on the PIANC website. That described some strategies that port and waterway operators can take to help to deal with climate change uncertainty. What type of assessment, how to move away from looking at the past as a guide to the future, how to embed adaptive capacity into and flexibility into design so that your infrastructure can be modified as conditions change rather than taking a decision in advance as to how much change is going to be expected if it's really not known. And the second area that was constraining ports' ability to invest in adaptation was how to make the business case, how to communicate to those that are making decisions on finance about what the consequences might be and how to ensure that the money is available for that investment. And this is really what Technical Note No. 2 is about. It's about facilitating understanding of the consequences of inaction. So if you don't invest in adaptation, what might happen, and how do you analyze and quantify those consequences to understand the benefits of investing? And also looking beyond impacts on damage and disruption, what other reasons are there that may help a port or waterway operator make the business case for that investment? So looking first at the consequences of inaction, we saw from the survey that some of the changes that are typically associated with and expected as a result of climate change can result in significant cost consequences, whether that's direct damage, whether it's cleanup, whether it's disruption and the ultimately impact on the supply chain. And I think it's important to be clear here that inaction doesn't only refer to a failure to raise or strengthen or otherwise modify infrastructure. Inaction also refers to failure to maintain existing infrastructure and systems, to anticipate extreme events and to make sure that your facility is best prepared to actually accommodate and deal with those events. Failure to monitor and to understand trends, to support early warning systems, to inform decisions, and ultimately a failure to assess risks and to plan. So when we talk about inaction, we're not only talking about the failure of a port or waterway operator to make this investment in strengthened resilience in terms of infrastructure. There's a lot of other actions that can be taken that help to strengthen resilience and reduce risk. And I think in this respect, it's important to be aware that this is quite a nice quote. Climate change adaptation is a strategic move. It's not a charitable act. It ensures resilience, risk management, and supply chain support in the face of the climate crisis. Governments, corporations, and impact investors fail to incorporate climate change adaptation measures into their strategies and not only missing out on returns, but also endangering their value chains. This way of thinking is really key to making the business case for investment in climate change adaptation responses. The technical note also looks at what are the most common barriers and what are the most common motivators to investment. And across the literature, when you look at what factors are limiting action on climate change adaptation, what we see is a lack of climate literacy, a lack of information, insufficient finance, the inappropriateness of business models. So for many ports and waterways, operators are looking at a 5 to 10 year planning horizon for infrastructure, but yet that infrastructure has a lifespan of 30 to 100 years. And in climate change terms, it's that period 30 to 100 years where we're likely to see most impact from the changing climate. We also see with the existing business models that if the location or timing of a hazard is uncertain, it's more likely that more immediate priorities take precedence. And so you continue this cycle of not taking action to adapt and not taking action to invest. We know there are some problems with a lack of agreed or consistent definitions and metrics. How do you define what is resilience? What is climate change resilience? How do you measure that in engineering terms? And what is this concept of resilient investment? So work is being done by others as well as PIANC internationally to try and help define, improve the definition of resilience. And PIANC's Markham is just starting a working group on resilient. What is a resilient port? What does a resilient port look like?
Hey, Jen,
And
sorry to
another,
interrupt. You got about 10 minutes left, just as a mark.
okay, perfect, thank you. So another area where we see a limit on adaptation action is in the lack of awareness of acceptance of when to transition from incremental change to transformational change. And this is something also that's important for port operators, is if you always do things incrementally, when to sit up and look at the big picture and see whether or not actually is the port still viable long-term in a climate change context, or do you actually need to be looking at the location of the port or the nature of the port operations? In terms of motivating adaptation action, then we're looking at, we see a lot of change where ports have experienced an unprecedented event or had a near miss. We see in those cases the operator is more likely to be responding and adapting than if they haven't had that experience. We certainly see some action on adaptation where there's a regulatory compliance issue, where there's a reporting requirement, or also in terms of private sector with risk reduction, setting KPIs, meeting CSR targets. In other words, what are shareholders demanding as good practice? And we see the evolving initiatives in the insurance sector. We'll hear more about that today. In the finance sector, can I get finance if I can't demonstrate resilience? And increasingly, again, with the private sector, attention to climate-related financial risk disclosure. PIANC does a lot of work on nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions can help strengthen resilience, reduce damage losses, and may help keep insurance affordable. So we're not only looking at classic grey engineering solutions when we talk about adaptation. And I think for me, what is key to making the business case is understanding that risk reduction through adaptation action delivers multiple benefits. This so-called triple dividend. It helps to avoid and reduce economic losses. It brings positive gains through risk reduction, safeguarding investment, and enabling productivity. And it delivers additional social and environmental benefits. Avoiding those losses represents a key benefit of investing in strength and resilience. But this concept of damage costs or disruption costs avoided isn't currently familiar to many of those in the port and navigation sector. For me, coming a long time ago from flood risk management, flood damage avoided is the way that you justify investment in flood protection. But for port, particularly for private sector, but also public sector port and waterway operators, the idea of damage costs avoided as a benefit of investment is not yet widely understood. And I think this is really key when we look at the business case. In terms of scoping the business case assessment, then between them, these This suite of PIANC guidance helps you understand and quantify financial loss exposure. It helps understand what is an acceptable level of risk. It helps understand the consequences of inaction and to quantify those consequences. The guidance, those 3 documents that I've mentioned, particularly the last one, helps to ensure that system-level consequences are identified and quantified. That includes interdependencies, the cascading failures in interlinked systems. It includes socio-economic implications for local communities and the supply chain issues. So these things that I was introducing earlier come together here in the assessment process. And of course, we also need to look at adaptation costs. So we need to be sure that we've looked at not only the high cost structural, physical, technological options, but also the low cost quick win options, early warning systems, contingency plans, alternatives, access storage, and so on, digitalization. So some of these good practice, relatively cheap actions can help massively strengthen resilience to climate change. We also need to look for some ports and waterway operators whether there are additional aspects that need to be included in making the business case. Some of those revolve around finance. In order to access affordable finance, there may be a requirement to demonstrate resilience. In order to secure affordable insurance or to demonstrate business continuity planning, there may be a need to demonstrate resilience. Risk disclosure, we talked about already, the exposure to climate-related financial risk. There may be a requirement, a legal or regulatory requirement, or there may be a need to avoid compliance failures or penalties. There may be contractual implications if you don't deliver because of climate change that is now foreseeable. Avoid the legal disputes that might arise as a result. There are the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals that need to be achieved. Corporate objectives, project authorization processes actually is where we most see now an expectation that adaptation and resilience, it has been considered for new investment. But we're often talking here not only about new investment, but also investment in strengthening and resilience of existing infrastructure. And for some businesses, it'll be important to realise or consolidate opportunities and to protect reputation. The guidance, technical note number 2, sets all this out in a single flowchart where the green boxes highlight the costs avoided that can be avoided by investment, costs for physical damage, costs for disruption and delays, costs for failures elsewhere in the system, cascading effects in the green boxes. The orange box highlights the importance of recognising for some organisations the supply chain implications for wider economic or societal parameters. For some organisations, the blue boxes will be important. These relate to finance, insurance, and contractual and legal obligations. And then, of course, there will, in the grey box, be some organisations will benefit from investing in adaptation because it brings opportunities. I think what we've learned from all of this work that we've done within the PIANC Permanent Task Group on Climate Change is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Making the business case will depend on the nature of the organisation, its management or governance model, and the measures and methods that are used to determine return on investment that are peculiar to that organisation. Some organisations will be driving towards adaptation because of the requirements of financial institutions. Others will be following government guidance on economic analysis. Private sector operators may be more concerned about cash flow. But most organisations, when they're making a business case for investment in adaptation, will be in a situation where there are competing priorities for limited resources. And really, that's what technical note number 2 is aiming to do. It's not prescriptive. It's bringing an understanding of the consequences of inaction, what to investigate and assess and quantify, and the respective costs and benefits of that investment. So it's designed to support port owners, operators, and investors by raising awareness of what might usefully be included in their business case, rather than prescriptive methodology that everybody needs to follow. So from me, that's all. The publications I've discussed you can download on the PIANC website. If you have questions, then please put those in the chat. But we're going to look first at a more perspective from the insurance sector to focus in on this element before we open up for questions and the panel discussion. And as Brian said, when you have questions, please use the chat, not the raise hand function, because we have too many people really to work effectively with raised hands today. So from my side, that's it. I'll hand over back to Brian and on to Neil.
All right. Thanks, Jan. I appreciate what you said, and everybody, do please put your questions in the chat as you think of them, so you don't have to remember them later. And we'll go ahead and ask Neil to start his talk, and that will set us up for a panel discussion at the 1 hour mark.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much, John. I'm just going to share my slides. Let's have a look. So, there we go. Can we see that? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm Neil Dallas. Brian introduced me earlier on. I'm a port engineer by profession. Working in the insurance industry, so I work within the loss prevention function at TT Club. But what I thought would be worthwhile me doing is sort of giving a bit of a background around TT Club, what we do, the reason why climate change and climate change adaptation is important to us, and then sort of give some insight into the data that we see as an insurer within the industry, and what we see as potential gaps, but also some things which we see as sort of good practice. So first of all, I'll talk through that. But one of the things I wanted to do was, after I've given an introduction to TT Club, is give a bit of an overview on where climate related claims fit within the wider scope of what we see as an insurer. So I thought we'd run through that. So in terms of an introduction, TT stands for through transport. Means that we insure cargo throughout the supply chain, which includes ports and terminals. The club part is because we're a mutual. So essentially, TT Club is not for profit. We actually run for the members, the insured members, and the board is actually made up from individuals from within the membership, providing comprehensive cover which is tailored to the industry. So we don't insure sort of private property or vehicles or anything like that. It's specifically for our industry. We were set up in 1968 around the containerization of cargo, and that came about because the traditional P&I clubs, there wasn't a real appetite to insure containers because of some of the land-based operation where the containers gone. So that's the reason why the club came about. And to that end, we currently insure around 80% of the world's container volumes, and we've also got an insurable interest in two-thirds of the top 100 ports worldwide, plus many more. I think we've got around about 1,800 members worldwide, and we service them with over 20 offices globally. But why am I here to speak today? Well, TT Club's mission isn't actually to sell more insurance. It's to make the global transport and logistics industry safer, more secure, and more sustainable. So we provide a loss prevention function, which I sit in. So it's industry or ex-industry professionals who work within the insurance industry, and we try and share best practice, good practice that we see, but also highlight any things from the claims data. So in terms of the overall claims that we see, which is was really interesting to me when I first came into the industry, when we are sitting in our ports and terminals, we don't really get to see what is happening elsewhere. Now, I think some of the interesting stuff that we can share here is get a bit of an idea is that what we see within the industry and how we can share that and learn from it as an industry. So fire makes up 11% of the claims costs for ports and terminals. So property damage, cargo fire. Reefer cargo, so interestingly, it's only 4% of the claims, but a lot of spoiled food is generated through just sort of human error. So setting the reefers at minus instead of positive, or vice versa, or setting it in degrees C rather than degrees Fahrenheit. It's sort of simple mistakes that, but again, it accounts for 4% of the claims cost. What we're here to talk about today, extreme weather events. This actually makes up 13% of the claims across ports and terminals. You know, what probably a lot of people on the call are aware. It's interesting how many times we hear the term extreme weather event, and how that 13% is going to change as the climate continues to change. Fraud and theft, it's only 4% of the club's claims, but it's interesting, I think, as especially with cybercrime, as the cyber criminals become more motivated and increasingly better resourced, how we keep ourselves abreast of fighting that or counteracting cybercrime. It's going to be interesting one to watch as well. I think anybody who works in the port and terminal or logistics facilities, logistics industry will know that damage to vehicles and people resulting from coming in contact with vehicles is a known, well-known risk, and that makes up 10% of the TK club's claims. Ship-related incidents, I know this is only 4% of the claims costs that we see for ports and terminals, but actually when it does happen, it's normally a big claim and can create an awful lot of disruption within the ports and terminals. Slips and trips, something that's been an issue, I think, in most industries, but we see 7% of the club's claims costs from that. It's not particularly, one of the biggest issues that's on everybody's mind, but some of these incidents can be life changing, and it's a real challenge for ports and terminals to be able to deal with that, given the type of equipment that we use, but also the cargo that we handle as well. By far the greatest, a third of the costs, is damage to infrastructure and assets. So whether it's something striking something or it's being misused, so overloading, well, this accounts for a third of TT Club's costs. And finally, environmental spills, release of some contaminants, whether it's cargo getting spilt or it's hydraulic oil or diesel from the plant of equipment. Again, a bit like the vessel hitting the quay or the cranes. Well, you know, it's a small amount. It's only 3% of the claims costs, but actually when it does happen, there can be significant cleanup and indeed reputational damage as well. So I thought that was worthwhile, just giving that insight into the sort of where climate claims fit within the sort of wider insurance industry and what we see from it as an insurance company. But interestingly, as we go around the world, and we've got members in a lot of different places around the globe, it sort of strikes me that why is this a problem? We have ports and terminals in some of the hottest, driest, but also the wettest and indeed the coldest areas around the world, all of which are designed to function in these areas. Well, fundamentally, from a simple engineering point of view, that when you think about any infrastructure, really is why is it designed the way it's designed? Well, from a geometric point of view, potentially what you're handling, what you need to do there. So the number of containers, whether it's bulks, it's going to have silos, how you're going to get in and out of the port, dictates the sort of general shape of what the port is. Then thinking about the capacity or the structural capacity of the stuff that you've built, the infrastructure that you've got. So the loading that you're putting on that, whether or not, as an example, the size of the cranes that you need to put in there, the size of the plant or the cargo. But also, I think importantly for us to think about, especially the non-engineers to think about, is that actually the environment plays a huge part in the design of the infrastructure. So whether we're thinking about the rainfall intensity, which will give us the design for the drainage, or the sea state, or the wave, or the that's impacting our breakwaters. All of these things impact how we design our infrastructure. And I think, interestingly for us, especially as being an engineer, if I was tasked or wanted to put a larger crane on a quay, which it wasn't designed for, then I wouldn't dream of doing that without sort of, checking the structural capacity and what the impact that might be on the quay. Now, climate change and the change in climate is sort of being forced upon us. It's happening. So one of these major design criteria is changing. So really, we need to sort of think about what the impact is going to be on our infrastructure. When we look at that graph on the bottom right-hand side, and one of the things which is a sort of a concern, or sort of really should drive the do nothing options for us, or the no regret options, is when you look at even the best case scenarios, and we think about what I said before about how regular we hear about extreme weather events, is even in the best case scenarios, we aren't going to be going back to sort of 1950 levels for centuries. So what we're seeing now, even in the best case scenario, and how we're dealing with that, what the impacts are on your ports and terminals, are going to be around to stay for the foreseeable future. So if we have a bit of a think about some sound bites from the insurance sector. When I was updating this slide, actually, I had down as 2023 was the record hottest year. Well, actually, 2024 has also been is beaten that, has now become the record hottest year. Albeit it doesn't feel like that up here in the northeast of England at the moment, but that's what it is. And interestingly, one of the big reinsurance companies have come out and said that global losses for natural catastrophes exceeded that 100 billion mark for 5th year in a row, and that's now at 135 billion for last year, which is a huge sum of money. But I think worryingly is that they're also estimating that that's going to that could double in the next 10 years. Things from like sort of record-breaking hailstorms that we've seen in Italy recently, and flooding events. I could put multiple lists in from around the globe about what about different events that we've seen, or climate events. But I think some of the things, the reason why I put hailstorms in there is that actually that is a big issue, and not something that we talk about, especially if you've got operating a car terminal where you've got 20,000-30,000 new vehicles on your site. So pretty much impossible to cover them. But these sort of events are a major concern for ports and terminals. But what I like to think of is, I like to think of these as signposts, each one of these events, to a disruptive and cost around the globe. Each one of these has created some type of disruption to the supply chain, the port, and indeed incurred costs. When I look at what we see in TT Club, we echo what the wider industry is seeing. Weather-related claims are increasing year on year, which is no surprise if the wider industry is seeing that as well. So why would you be bothered about it? Why invest if you've got insurance? Ports and terminals, and everybody's pretty much insured. Well, Interestingly, the UK HSE some 20 years ago now actually did a study into the uninsured costs versus the insurance returns when there's an incident or something happens within various different industries. Now, they didn't specifically cover our industry, but actually what they did is they give a range over various different industries from 8 to 36 times uninsured costs, from reputational damage, management stress, increased training, loss of management time. So there is a real sort of cost which you're not insured for, which isn't covered if you do suffer an extreme weather event, or indeed any other accident. When you bring it to recently what's been said, the World Economic Forum actually come out and said that that inactivity for climate change across a range of industries could put up to a quarter of the EBITDA at risk within the next 2 decades if they don't prepare. I haven't done a great deal of research into the numbers there, but I just thought it's an interesting figure to put up there, especially a recent one coming from the World Economic Forum, and actually the sort of ability for businesses to generate cash is at risk here. So when I think about resilience or climate resilience within ports, really what I'm thinking about here is the drop in operational performance and the time to recover. So we have a disruptive weather event, and then we have to recover from that. So really looking to think about from a resilience point of view is to minimize that red area under the graph. So we can do that through adaptation measures to be able to reduce the effect of a disruptive weather event on the operational performance, or we can put various measures in place to be able to recover more quickly from that event. I think personally, it makes sense to be able to do both. So look at the adaptation measures, and then also look at how you're going to recover and how you're going to increase that resilience to minimize or indeed remove that red area under the graph. In climate resilience, I think what's driving it? I'm sort of thinking about my time when working for a port and logistics operator, specifically looking at climate change, and what's driving it. So interestingly, how much is this going to be driven by operations? And it'd be interesting if anybody on the chat is got a comment on this. So when we think about major extreme weather events which have a huge impact on the operation, then they're obvious. But actually, climate change can be sort of hiding in plain sight. How many high wind events do you have which where you can't operate your cranes or you can't operate your yards? Now we get these type of things regularly, and we've had them for a long time. But actually, is the frequency increasing? So is there operational constraints which aren't extreme weather events but are being driven by a change in climate, so increasing the frequency of non-extreme weather events which are impacting your profitability of your business or be able to service customers? So I think that's a real interesting one, I think, for us to be really thinking about. And then multiple climate risks. I think Jan touched on this about where a organisation or a port and terminal has experienced either a near miss or actually a climate event which has created a problem for them. So they tend to be, from my experience within the membership, laser focused on a particular area. Sometimes at the detriment of there being additional climate risks which aren't being looked at. For me, it's a holistic view, and then looking at what the sort of criticality of each of these events might be, so you can really understand how these might impact your operation, not only from an insurance point of view, from where we see the losses, but actually how it's going to just affect your day-to-day operation. So final slide from me, sort of really trying to look at avoiding not looking at just one single risk. I'm not saying that you don't need to focus on the big, on the real big issues that you've got, but sort of looking at it from a holistic point of view. Really sort of considering the sort of short-term, long-term measures, how that fits in. These plans all need to fit together, so you're not sort of undoing some good work that you've done in the past or creating problems for yourself in the future. And accommodating uncertainty. Now, as an engineer, I think that is a real difficult problem. It's trying to deal with what's in front of you without really having a good idea of what the case may be, but actually building on that, making sure that whatever you're putting in place is going to be able to be modified in the future to really sort of accommodate the changes in the climate. And then understanding when to act. So what are you actually monitoring? I mentioned before about understanding the sort of operational issues that you're having. Think of them as sort of tremors before an earthquake. There might not be the big catastrophic event, but treating climate events or sort of weather-related either near misses or operational impacts pretty much the same way as we do accidents, sort of recording them, trying to understand them, seeing what's happening to sort of really build a picture in your local area about what's happening. And unfortunately, I don't think this is something that you're going to be able to fit and forget. Continued review. I think that sort of the recent changes to the ISO standard, which are embedding this into management processes for all organisations, is the right thing to do. It's this sort of climate resilience is going to be a continuous review that's be embedded in our risk management, I think, for some time to come. And then just before I drop off, I just wouldn't mind, there's a QR code on there. TT Club, a huge amount of information in terms of the claims that we see from within the organisation. And we try and share good practice or highlight any issues we've got, and we sort of, you can scan the QR code, or you can have a look at it later and come to TT Club website and sign up to the regular newsletter. It's and then please do feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or anything like that if you want to have a chat after this as well. It's we're always sort of keen to help out. Stop sharing. I'll just pass back to you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Jan, for your talks. We actually finished before the hour, so good. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I'd like to introduce one more person, if I can find the right email that has the intro. I'd like to introduce Aaron Healy, also from TT Club, and Aaron, if you can come on screen or at least be ready to unmute your mic to join the panel discussion. So Neil, Jan, and Aaron will basically be here for discussion to answer questions that you guys might have, and wait for, is Aaron in the meeting? I'm not sure. There we go, got a hand raised, perfect. Yeah, you might want to hop on camera, Aaron, just to be ready to answer questions if you like.
Am I not visible currently?
Well, you were for a second and now you're not, so I'll defer to others if they see you.
I see Aaron okay, so I think
okay,
yeah,
good. It's just the way my screen's working then. No problem then. So with that, we can start taking questions. I see a few things in the chat. One is a request for information and publications on resources that contain quantified costs for different kinds of adaptation measures. I would say some of these are best answered in an email follow-up. So I will say those that are very long answers or asking for lists and additional resources, the panel here, we will develop answers and send them out to the email addresses that are included in the registration. So if you did register, then you'll be in that list. But and Jana, you got your hand raised. Yeah. Go ahead. Then I'll ask the question. Yeah.
So I think at the very bottom of the question, it says that the lady says that in her experience, this type of information on the cost of adaptation measures is very hard to find. And I think absolutely, I think the port navigation sector is sometimes not good at sharing this kind of information. So it is difficult sometimes to find the information on what adaptation measures costs. So I think I would suggest two things, and both of these can be followed up through technical note number 2. I think there is in technical note number 2, there were various very short summaries of case studies, and those case studies came either from Working Group 178 or from a conference that was held in the as a side event for the COC conference in Glasgow. And those do provide some illustrations of action taken by ports to adapt, whether that's early warning systems or raising quay walls or whatever. And in some cases, there are costs associated with those. The survey itself that we carried out, that's annexed to the technical note number 2, has information on costs, but they're not, those costs are not granular in terms of particular measures. They're more the overall cost of the consequence of an event, and then some of the case studies suggest responses. But the other thing that we have started to do is that other sectors are looking at this more closely. And in the UK, for example, there's a really good publication that's been done in support of the British government's climate change adaptation preparedness, which explores some of the measures such as early warning systems, such as some of the quick wins, some of the low-hanging fruit, and it looks at actually providing benefit costs for those. And that's where the figures that I think maybe in the report, maybe I didn't use today, but that show that the benefits of adaptation, investing in adaptation, can be between a benefit cost ratio of 2 to 1 right up to 10, 12, 15 to 1. And some of those are also linked to specific measures. And I think an early warning system is an early warning system. And in a way, it doesn't matter whether it's the port navigation sector or agriculture or flooding or the water industry that is carrying out that work. So I agree, it is quite difficult to find the information, but I think also it's important to look laterally and to look at what other sectors are doing, and some of those sectors are better at sharing information on costs than other sectors. So I think, but I would encourage you to look at the reference list for Technical Note 2 and for the Working Group 178 report, and hopefully you'll find some information there that's helpful. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jan. Any of Neil or Aaron, any comments on that?
Yeah. So just to pitch in there and briefly introduce myself. So I'm Aaron Healy of the TT Club as well. So I'm an underwriter for TT. So I negotiate the terms, conditions, and price of entry to the club for the sort of ports and terminals globally, and sort of support with underwriting expertise. On that particular question, I'd probably say it's an area we're conscious of, and we're conscious because if you're a small or even a medium-sized port, there is no first mover advantage in that level of investment, really. So one thing we're quite keen to do is share success stories with as much detail as we can with our members that fall into that bracket. So one of the things that Neil and our loss prevention team have been working on is our ESG hub, ESG toolkit, and one of the main features of that is highlighting case studies with success stories of investment in ESG initiatives. So off the top of my head, some of the things we've covered recently, we covered a Scottish port that was utilising not widely known government funding to invest in electric vehicles and alternative fuels. We covered electric tugs in New Zealand, and I appreciate both of those aren't specifically resilience to climate change, but that is the sort of story we'll be looking to cover on the ESG Hub. So I think that's just to say that resource is available not just to TT Club members, but to anyone that might be interested. And equally, we'd like to take submissions from anyone, not just from TT Club members, but that's just a resource that I wanted to highlight.
Great, thank you. Thank you. There's two related questions, one about references and one about TT's position. So we'll do Renee's question first. What is TT Club's position on investments in nature-based solutions that may not generate revenue, but avoid cost? Sorry, Renee, I modified your question a little. But what's your position as sort of your perspective on nature-based solutions that may help to avoid costs, but don't maybe generate additional revenues?
Yeah, I'll pick that one up, Aaron. So nature-based, you know, I don't think that TT Club would have any real sort of objection to nature-based solutions as long as they're an engineered solution. And actually, that sort of segues nicely into what Aaron was saying. And actually, if anybody out there has got a nature-based solution which is working and they would like to share, then that would be something that we would want to share within our ESG toolkit to sort of promote that. I mentioned in my presentation that it's not just to make our mission statements to make it safer, more secure, and more sustainable. So yeah, it's absolutely something that TT Club would support an engineered nature-based solution that's going to work for sure.
Sure. I'll follow on question. I guess Neil or Aaron, is that something that TT Club would ensure? Like if we designed a nature-based solution that helped to avoid other costs or avoid damage, is that nature-based solution itself insurable as an asset?
Probably one for me. Possibly, yes. I mean, it completely depends what it was. So generally, in the insurance industry, land values aren't insurable, but assets and structures are. So it would totally depend on the asset itself.
Sure. Okay. There's a follow-on question or a related question about providing information and resources on nature-based solutions, adaptation measures. So pose that to the group. Maybe Jan first, unless you had something else you wanted to say, Jan.
No, I was volunteering to respond to that one. So
Sure.
I think those of you that are familiar with PIANC will know that we have a concept called working with nature, which looks at very much at how nature-based solutions can help to deliver benefits and reduce costs for ports and waterways. And of course, when you look then in the climate change context, sustaining the ecosystem services that nature-based solutions provide, whether that's the buffering effect of marsh or mangroves against storm, whether it's the water purification function, and so on. The working with nature philosophy, which was developed 2008, there's a PIANC guidance on implementing working with nature as a practice that was published a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago maybe. And PIANC's NBCOM at the moment does actually have a proposal for looking at a working group that will bring together the idea of working with nature and the additional resilience in a climate change context that such solutions can offer. So I think the question about the information reference on nature-based solutions adaptation measures, I think in many cases it's kind of implied already in the guidance, working with nature guidance, which is working group report 176 from PIANC's NBCOM. But if this is something you're interested in, then there will be, I think, in the coming year, or maybe even coming few months, a call for members for a new working group, which will look specifically at this issue of nature-based solutions for strengthening resilience. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great. And then Jan, I saw you had a couple of questions maybe to ask Neil and Aaron, but I'm going to hop through some of the attendees questions first, and then we can come back to that maybe. Question: are dikes or breakwaters, and I guess dikes could also be levees, included in the kind of structures that TT Club can provide insurance against climate change risks, like overtopping or flooding risks?
Yes, yes. So those sort of structures fall within the property that we do insure for ports. I mean, they're a challenging area of property because they're generally the most exposed property, and we are seeing both with TT Club members and non-members increased instances of damage to breakwaters and the sort of more exposed jetties. So there is a sort of trend there. I don't have data to hand, but you know, sort of anecdotally, that is something we're seeing, and I think no doubt that will be a continued trend.
And I think, Brian, if I may, my question actually
Yeah.
follows quite well on from that, because
Yeah.
I think one of the questions that we identified in Technical Note 2, and we found some embryonic examples when we looked internationally, is this the two sides of the same coin, these questions. One is, if ports fail to invest in strength and resilience or act on adaptation, what measures might the insurance sector need to take? And I'm thinking there particularly about either increasing premiums or refusing insurance, because I think with the domestic market, I think that's something that's already an issue in some areas, in some countries. And then the other side of that is, what else can or should the insurance industry more generally, not TT specifically, but more generally, what actions, what responsibility does the insurance sector have to try and incentivize adaptation action? And is that also related to reducing premiums for demonstrated resilience, or increasing premiums if people are refusing to invest, and so on? Because with the changing climate, I think one thing that is clear is that business as usual as was for many operators and many, I guess, insurance companies in many countries, business as usual is no longer sustainable, because with the increasing frequency of these events, with the fact that these events are becoming arguably foreseeable rather than unprecedented or unforeseen, I think I'm kind of interested in how you think the insurance industry generally, what lessons and what measures can the sector take?
I think, Aaron, I'll pick up what the sector is doing currently in terms of, and I would sort of urge pretty much everybody to go and actually have a look and see what the insurance companies are actually putting out there in terms of guidance and support. The insurance industry, and I sort of alluded to in my presentation, is we get an awful lot of claims that actually the types of things where ports and terminals, when they're considering could it happen during doing the risk assessment, what's the likelihood? Well, actually, the insurance industry around the globe, it has happened. So there's an awful lot of learning and information there which can go out there. So if you're wanting a prompt to action, you know, have a look. You know, sort of there's a few examples. So Swiss Re, Munich Re, TT Club, we put an awful lot of information out there. There's many more. So if you ever want the motivation to understand what actually can happen at your facility and the costs and the likely disruption that might have, there's quite a lot of information out there. And likewise, there's an awful lot of study work that goes into, you know, the sort of potential risks from a climate point of view within the insurance, so when they're underwriting it. So in terms of what they're doing, is there's an awful lot of stuff that's trying to get pushed out there to try and, for an education point of view. How visible that is with from the ports and terminals, and indeed the professionals who are working in supporting them, I'm not sure. It's not something that I looked at, I've got to admit, when I was working for a port and terminal operator. So it's good to highlight that, and I'd please sort of urge you to go and have a look at that in the first instance. If you've got anything to add, Aaron.
Yeah, if I may just pitch in, because I think there are sort of two parts to Jan's question. There is, you know, what's the industry doing and what can it do to support incentives and support the business case for investment in infrastructure to improve resilience, and then on the other side of the coin, what happens if not? So on the underwriting side, TT Club, one of the things that we do is get quite stuck into the weeds in risk assessments with our members. So that means visiting the facility. We look at the asset management programs. We look at dredge depths and suitability of quays and bollards for ever larger sort of modern vessels. And those assessments give us a bit of an insight into what we deem to be the level of risk that each port contributes to the club. And if the result of those discussions and that assessment, which, you know, it does include investment in infrastructure and keeping up to date both with vessels and with the environment in which the port is operating, that leads us to decisions that we make on terms and conditions and price of entry. And we use other tools as well. So there is software, there's software available to insurers that maps the exposure to natural catastrophes of locations, and that's something we use. So that will, if we enter the location of a port, that software will tell us the frequency and potential severity of catastrophe events. So the big ones we look at are earthquake, windstorm, and flood. And it's slightly more nuanced than that. So it will give us, whether it's a river flood or a flash flood or a storm surge, or whether there's an increased hail exposure, that sort of thing. But those tools are used both by us and by sort of general property insurers. So they're a little bit blunt for by the nature, ports are near water. So it doesn't necessarily account for property that's constructed with the intention of getting wet, and therefore it might be considered a flood risk where it so much isn't. So what I'm getting to is that we're now approaching the area of artificial intelligence, and one of the ways that I see that improving the way we work is more nuanced modeling of catastrophe risks. I think that's going to deliver better information on things like age and construction of infrastructure, and key heights, and that's going to deliver us better models in order to inform how we sort of construct policies and provide insurance to ports. And the other side of the coin, which we talked about, which was sort of incentives and support. So we talked about our ESG hub, and that's all about sharing experiences and trying to give those success stories to ports. And the other thing we can do is probably more systematic incentives. So what I alluded to with the risk assessments was, as a result of those discussions, and again, when we have that improved modeling, one of the things we'll look to do, of course, is to consider whether those warrant changes to premium. Investment in infrastructure, which improves what we deem to be the risk a port presents to the club, will necessarily be looking at discounts to premium, and equally, failure to invest is going to lead to penalties, and that could mean increased premiums in the short term. It could mean that insurance just won't be available in the longer term. So to use the statistic that Neil presented earlier, 5 years in a row with losses exceeding $100 billion in the property insurance industry, that's estimated to double within 10 years. So if you just sort of take those numbers, what it tells you at the very least is that insurance premiums will have to double within 10 years to maintain, or for insurers to maintain their solvency position. So I guess ask yourselves at ports whether you have the budget. If your insurance is currently costing you, say, 0.5% of the value of your assets each year, will your budgets allow for that to be 1% or 2% in the years to come? And further than that, do you have a port insurer that will listen and respond to your business case for investing in climate resilience? And can they give you an indication of how that might affect your terms and your conditions and your premium in the future? And as I said, looking beyond the next 10 years and that figure that losses are going to double, I think the response from the insurance industry might be a bit more significant than simply increasing premiums. It might be that, in sort of zone A catastrophe zones, insurance just might be unavailable for those sort of events that are no longer catastrophes, but just, in fact, run-of-the-mill in the nature of being in that zone. So that's what I'd say on those 2 points.
Yeah, thanks very much, Aaron. That's really useful. And I think your point there about, are ports able to sustain a doubling of the cost of insurance. On the other side of that is you can take that as a cost avoided to put as a benefit, an annual benefit in your business case. And I think that's really why that's the sense in which the PIANC guidance picks up on the issues of access to finance, access to insurance, and so on. Because for some ports, not all, but for some ports and waterway operators, if the cost of insurance is going to double, then and in some cases that could be quite a significant cost. Then if you invest that money instead in that amount of adaptation response and measures in preparedness, then you have a double win, because not only are you not incurring that additional cost, but you're also getting the non-insurable benefits of that measure. And that comes back to Neil's slide of how much of your losses are insurable and how much are not, because adaptation measures deliver resilience and reduce losses both on the insured and non-insured side. So I think that's a really useful answer. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I thought of a question, Aaron, as you were talking through that, and just coming from working on flood projects in the US and FEMA being our flood insurance agency for many things, not ports, but other things. So there's some very specific standards that FEMA has for considering infrastructure that reduces risk. Like, how would TT Club, or what you know of the industry, if I had a port and I was going to do some sort of adaptation project to flood proof my buildings or raise the assets or build a bigger breakwater or something, how do you guys consider those infrastructure changes, because they are so case by case? Like, would there be a set of standards and you'd evaluate plans, or is it more of a categorical thing?
Yeah, I think the answer is case by case, because it has to be, because and that's why there are, you know, people like me, the insurance industry and personal lines, home insurance, that's completely sort of portalized. There's not someone like me sitting around looking at each case, but ports are different, you know, every territory is different, and within that each port is unique. So we can, and we have the resource to look at these case by case. And it's a good question. And I think you can, and I would encourage anyone who's interested on this webinar to approach their insurer, especially if they think they're exposed to, you know, river flood or something like that, and just ask, you know, how much of my premium that I'm paying to insure the property is, you know, sort of proportioned to that river flood exposure. And therefore, if I was to raise key heights by so many meters, could we change that picture? Or if I'm going to build a new facility which is raised by so many meters, could we adjust the rates to factor that in? And I think any insurer who's attuned to the industry will be receptive, hopefully, to that argument. We certainly would be. And then equally, if you're a port that's had an event in recent history, and you've made a large claim on your insurance that's arisen from a catastrophe event like that, and you're thinking about investing in sort of in mitigation, increased resilience, it's another thing to talk to your insurer about, because actually your insurer will be looking at that event and they'll be deeming that to be a, you know, a 1 in 15 year or a 1 in 25 year, and that would be counting towards premiums. So if you're looking at investing in the sort of mitigation that could mean that's going to be a 1 in 100 year instead, that can be factored in as well. So it's worth just having those conversations.
Perfect. Thank you. There's only one other question that I see in the chat, and it's semi-related to something we talked about earlier, but I'll put it out there anyway. Can TT Club provide support or knowledge about the extent of monetary risks of climate change for a port, so a basis for assessing benefits of adaptation measures and their costs is created? Yeah, so I'll ask Neil and Aaron to pick that up, and it might be also be a written response at some point.
Yeah, I think just a quick response on that. It's difficult to give general advice on that without the specific knowledge of what it is. I think that what we can do is we can provide sort of general figures around the impacts that we see from climate change in a bit more granular detail. But in terms of case by case on individual facilities, because, you know, as gets said so often, all ports are pretty are unique. So it's difficult to give general information like that.
think actually just a thought occurred to me, because I kind of answered this question earlier with regard to the PIANC guidance, but that particular question also prompted me to think about a publication by UNCTAD, a port-specific publication by UNCTAD that also, I'm pretty sure, it'll be referenced in either Technical Note 2 or Working Group 178, but that did look at, in some cases, at the costs that were incurred. Again, to be able to use those as cost avoided, or to work from the known cost estimates, looking to create an average annual damage disruption cost avoided. So actually the UNCTAD reference in at least Technical Note number 2 might also help provide a few case studies. There are relatively few, but there are some out there.
Great, thanks. There's one or two other questions I could ask, but I wanted to just kind of do a note, because as I was listening, I was thinking about, from my perspective as a modeler and design engineer, I think about things that when you design a port that, I don't know, probably aren't catastrophe, they're operational, downtime, being able to operate the port. And I think Aaron noted that certain things that we now consider extreme events can at some point become operational day-to-day events. So that's challenging, given that we don't know how fast things are going to change when. But PIANC PTGCC also published a Technical Note 1 in advance of the TN2 that Jan mentioned, that is about making decisions and designs in the face of uncertainty. So if you guys are designing new facilities, also take a look at PTGCC Technical Note 1, which kind of helps with some of those factors that are not necessarily catastrophes, but are operational design factors. So another question that I thought of as Neil was going through the slides on different things that can happen at a port, the sketches of things that might be insured. Like, which of those do you see being most prone to, or semi-prone to, climate change?
Yeah, I think what's interesting on them figures that I gave, I think it was 13% as of the claims are due to weather-related incidents. I think what and something that we're currently working on is actually what of these other items have got a contributing factor due to climate-related issues. So imagine, we had 4% down for ship damage on berths. Well, actually, how much of that berth in this some that we're doing some work on actually is a climate-related contributing factors that we're not picking up in that. And in my sort of gut feeling is that there is. You can imagine that whether you're trying to berth a vessel, or indeed there's increased windage on the vessel, so a bollard or is being damaged, or fenders being damaged, or indeed just difficulty in berthing the vessel, where you're bringing the vessel in, and whether or not we've all seen the videos on YouTube where cranes are being hit by and how much of the actual of these type of incidents have a contributing factor which is based on the weather, which is outside of the normal operations which the ports generally deal with. So there's that, but there's also, I think, is property and cargo damage. We've seen some recent cases, and indeed speaking with members around the world, is around hail. Sort of huge. It's a huge problem for especially car terminals. You can imagine the type of damage that you're looking at, and it's difficult to actually mitigate through sort of traditional physical measures. You can imagine trying to put a roof over 10-20,000 vehicles was pretty much impossible. So it's also trying to think about actually how do you do these potentially, how do you change maybe where you're storing items? Do you in high risk areas, do you split your risk? Do you change the layout so they're in different areas? So if a storm occurred there, so it's not just about spending multiple millions of dollars on a new adaptation measures, but actually is there stuff that doesn't actually cost a huge amount of money, where you can just change or de-risk your operation from these sort of not obscure but often unthought of issues such as hail.
Great. We've got about 2 minutes left in the time. I guess I'll ask Jan or Neil or Aaron if you have any sort of final comments. I don't see any additional questions to answer. So if you
Yeah.
have any
Okay,
closing
just-
comments?
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just to add to that, and we've kind of focused, or at least I have, on sort of loss and damage to assets within ports, but that doesn't, and Neil mentioned it just now with the hail and car terminals, but we haven't talked about damage to cargo handled by a terminal, and this is something that we talk to our members about quite a lot, in general, because it's not just weather that damages cargo, but in relation to hail and in general weather events. One of the things we talk to ports about is managing terms and conditions and contracts, because weather events like hail shouldn't be the responsibility of the terminal. It's what's generally considered to be a force majeure event. In most territories, there are certain jurisdictions where there is a legislative force majeure that is a bit more onerous on those handling cargo. But for the most part, in jurisdictions, you can negotiate a contract with a suitable force majeure provision, which will make events such as hail not the responsibility of the terminal. And it's generally the responsibility of the cargo interest to ensure their goods, so that they're damaged by events which aren't the fault of the port or the terminal. Then that sort of all risks cargo insurance will pay for it, and it can be de-risked by the port or terminal.
I think, Brian, just a final comment from my side comes back to Neil's observation there. One of the points that we've tried to stress throughout Working Group 178, Technical Note 1 and Technical Note 2 is the importance of looking at operational, at management, at behavioural changes, at institutional, economic and policy options when you're looking at adaptation, because certainly in the short term, those types of responses can buy time, reduce risk in the short to medium term, while more information is collected and while more data is available to inform decisions, particularly about infrastructure, which may have a design life of 30, 50 to 100 years. And I think the idea of contingency planning, the idea of early warning systems, the non-structural solutions, the policy solutions and so on, those can be really important in significantly reducing the risk, not eliminating the risk, but in significantly strengthening resilience and reducing the risk. So I think Neil's comment for me brings us really nicely back to almost where we started from in terms of the webinar. So yeah, and also from my side as chair of PTTCC, thank everybody for attending. It's been a really good attendance, a really good discussion, and thank you to Neil and to Aaron for joining us, because I think for me it's been a really useful insight and a slightly different perspective looking at the insurance industry, rather than looking only at the kind of physical damage and physical infrastructure and the costs there. So I think hopefully other people feel it's been a valuable session as well. But thanks to you both very much.
All right. It is time. Thanks, everyone. Jan has already said it. Thanks for attending, and thanks to Leon and Anne for setting up the webinar from PIANC side. Look forward to seeing answers to questions come out, maybe in written form, as we're able to address some of those, and then look for the recording to be available. And PIANC will post that. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheers
Bye.
now. Thank you.